Hello everyone, my name is Marissa Graber and today I will be speaking on disaster management with a specific focus on presidential disaster declarations. This topic is significant because it's really important that we understand how presidential decisions can shape disaster relief and how vital it can be to making effective policy and resource allocation. The article that I reviewed focused on disaster relief decision making, and it was over the time frame of 1989 to 2005, which was a time that we really seen a lot of changes in intergovernment relationships. This article aimed to uncover factors that influence decisions as well as the partisan influences to considerations of overwhelming need. It also focused on complexities of presidential disaster declarations and how they implicated the approach for community recovery in various scenarios. The reading that I focused on was Federal Disaster Relief in the United States, the role of political partisanship and preference in presidential disaster declarations and turndowns. And this reading really focused on the analysis of political influences, and it specifically looked at presidential disaster declarations. Some of the things that it examined was emergency versus major disaster designations. It also looked at partisan behavior, electoral influences, and the overwhelming need considerations. And then it also focused on resource allocation. As I mentioned previously, the time frame set for this analysis was from 1989 to 2005. Really focused on a couple of key focus points. So there was the community recovery evaluation, so emphasizing attention towards post-event evaluation and making sure that there's effective disaster management. They also focused on evidence-based policy revisions, so highlighting need for changes within this policy area and ensuring that disaster relief efforts are effectively targeted and utilized. They talked about efficient resource allocation, so making sure that these community recovery evaluations will allow for efficient allocations of these resources and optimize the impact of our disaster relief efforts within the country. And they talked about stakeholder engagement, so the importance of engaging stakeholders like local communities, government agencies, and relief organizations in that post-event evaluation process so we can really get some diverse perspectives and insights. And then lastly, they finalized the article with some policy recommendations, which I'll outline in my next slides, that were really aimed at improving disaster response, resilience, and recovery efforts. So to get us started, let's talk about the differences between emergency versus major disaster declarations. So when we're looking at an emergency declaration, that really is giving a governor a flexible pathway to get financial assistance from a federal entity. So we're looking at scenarios where they're removing debris or it's related to public safety. And then when we're shifting into the major disaster declaration, that requires a more comprehensive response, and there's usually more of a widespread devastation in those scenarios. So those declarations have a broader scope, and they usually require a more significant financial obligation. So when looking at a presidential decision dynamic, we really have to think about the preferential designation of an emergency during re-election years. Some of the things that this article talked heavily about is the complexities in this decision making. So there's a non-significant relationship between electoral votes and declaration success challenges. And the data throughout there really highlighted the complexity of the decisions that these presidents are facing throughout these scenarios. It's important for us to understand these distinctions and how crucial it is to comprehend the nuances in disaster relief policy and the rationale that can be really driving presidential declaration decisions in relation to disasters. So this article also explored how the Stafford Act empowers the president to consider extenuating circumstances when making a disaster declaration request. And it also talked about how there's been an increase in emergency declarations. So Some of the findings that were highlighted was that areas that had prior declarations within a 12-month period typically had a increase in emergency declarations following that time frame. And it also indicated the consideration of acute needs by FEMA and the president. It also talked about total taxable resources and the impact that that has, and it's the relationship that they had found ended up being a negative relationship between that and major disaster declaration success. Their findings were that it supported the idea for a needs-based decision making by the president. It also looked at state poverty level influence. Interestingly enough, they did find that state poverty levels were not significantly impacting presidential disaster declaration success, and that led to them suggesting that other factors likely play a more decisive role in those determinations. There were some insights that showed an overwhelming need and resource consideration having an impact to disaster policy formulation, and that there is an equitable distribution of federal disaster relief. They also found within their analysis that they ended up with a recommendation to reevaluate disaster policy priorities, and they recommended to focus on evidence-based revisions that would address the disparities in relief distribution and help enhance community recovery after disasters. The article also delves into the complexities of intergovernmental relations, and it specifically focused on those between state and federal branches and talked about statistical evidence that they had found that there is partisanship and biased vote seeking when looking at overwhelming need considerations. They did find statistical significance among some of the relationships, some of those being re-election years that are impacting major disaster declaration success, and then conflicting findings that were in reference to the US Senate and House party similarity and declaration rates. It also talked about partisan and public choice models. So it looked at if there's biased vote seeking that's inherent within our political system and how that poses challenges for equitable public service distribution and legislation implementation. It spoke to the need for rational decision making in these recommendations, and that despite the challenges that we face, that presidential disaster declaration decisions should be driven by rational choice and reasonable decision making rather than public choice influences. The study also considered what the role of mass media coverage is and how large-scale disaster events can really influence the declaration processes, and that there's a need for policy changes post the Stafford Act. And it provided the recommendation for policy focus to really shift towards post-event community recovery evaluation, and it also outlined an evidence-based approach for effective disaster policy revisions. On the topic of resource allocation and disparities, they did highlight an increase in presidential disaster declarations and disaster relief funding since the Stafford Act was initiated, and they also acknowledged that there's a role of media coverage and large-scale disasters that influence these factors. They talked about how intergovernmental relations and fiscal constraints can really impact this policy area, and that the discontinuation of federal revenue grants can really contribute to governor disaster declaration requests that are increased. They suggested some policy revisions to emphasize necessity and changes of the Stafford Act and the eligibility criteria for grants given in support of disaster events. And then they also stressed the importance of advocating for policy revisions to ensure that there's efficient federal disaster relief allocation. They also recommended, as I mentioned in my prior slide, to really shift towards that evaluation in a post-event to focus on if we have looked at a community recovery in disaster declared areas and if we can align our policy revisions in a way that can prevent any disparity of that disaster relief distribution. So, as I've discussed in some of my prior work for this semester, my focus on research has been related to defense acquisition policy with a particular lens on consolidation and mergers within the defense industrial base. And when I was reviewing this resource, I initially thought it might have been a stretch to tie it to that, with this one being focused on disaster response. But really, there's a lot of great key lessons that I was able to pull from this that I think apply heavily to the area that I'm researching. So, this reference talks heavily on the importance of evidence-based decision making and ensuring that we're having fairness when we're formulating policies. And that's so important in the defense acquisition policy world as well. We really have to make sure that we're having that transparency and that we're showing that we are consistent and fair in our decision making process. And it's important for us to really promote community resilience. So the article talked pretty heavily about post event evaluations and how that can effectively shape disaster management policy. And I think that's a neat approach to take from the perspective of defense industrial base. So perhaps we can do post consolidation um, evaluations that can help us understand what impact that's having on the entire base so we have a better understanding moving forward if consolidations and mergers are going to continue to be helpful for this industry area or if it's going to be a hindrance as we continue on and as we see continued financial constraints within the budgetary areas for the Department of Defense. So, as I mentioned, there are some parallels between the two. The biased decision making, lack of transparency, and reduced competition all impact defense industry policy. And I think there's definitely a correlation between the two. So making sure that we're having fair decision making, that we're transparent on why we're going to certain vendors and why we're allowing certain vendors to merge and consolidate and why we're going against others that might put us in a monopoly scenario. So it's really important for us to have that transparency and maintain public trust. Some of the policy recommendations that they provided was advocating for, learning about how to implement heavier restrictions on disaster response. So that's certainly something that I think would be beneficial from the perspective of defense acquisition policy related to mergers and consolidation. And I think it's important that we really promote fair competition and innovation. So, in conclusion, there really was a lot of lessons that I was able to pull from this, despite them being pretty significantly different policy environments. There's definitely a lot of overlap in approaches that can be taken, and I learned a lot from this resource.